Hi, Jegaysus.
Hi, heathens.
Hi, friends.
Okay, so I'm super excited because today we have another queen on the show. Although we have had the King of Queens for quite some time, we now have another queen who shares something with all of us, ADHD. So without further ado...
I was like, oh, is that my time to talk?
Without further ado...
Crushed it, nailed it. What did I say? I told you. I've never once
right
said
off
it.
the top, right there.
You're gonna fit in with us so well.
It's gonna be so good.
It's going to be great.
Okay, so if you didn't notice, we have CatieOsaurus.
Hello, I'm CatieOsaurus. We really we nailed that. That was good. But hi everybody, I'm CatieOsaurus. I am an ADHD educator and advocate. I talk a lot about like mental health on the internet, specifically TikTok is where I got my start. I am also, fun fact, a certified sex educator with a special interest in the meeting of neurodivergency in kink and BDSM. I also have a podcast. It's called Katie and Eric's Infinite Quest. We talk about life with ADHD and depression and navigating life as neurodivergent adults. And that's all I can think of right now. Hello, I'm happy to be here.
I think that was amazing. I've never introduced myself that good.
I know, right? I'm always like, hello, I'm Jesseca.
That is exactly it. The smile at the end is also
With the
identical.
thumbs up.
It's like,
I like to do an awkward thumbs up at the end so that way you know that I'm done talking. It's like, great.
That's my sign. I'm tapping out. That's all I got.
nonverbal cues are important.
Love them. Love them.
So I heard at least 6 really interesting things, and we're only doing one episode, which makes me like I'm happy you're here and sad that it's one episode because there's so many interesting things at once, right? So you are a sex ed educator on how neurodivergence interacts with kink. That's one of your like areas.
Yes.
Please say as many more things about that as you want to.
Yes.
That's a lot of really good, and I want to.
We've all taken the quiz. We've all taken the quiz, you know?
Okay, good. I love the quiz with like a capital T and Q. So basically I got my start on TikTok like a couple years ago at the very beginning of the pandemic, and I was specifically talking just kind of generally talking about like ADHD and depression and sort of my experiences as a late diagnosed neurodivergent person who had sort of like been very like academically successful, and I wasn't really like the picture of what you might think of when you think of ADHD. And then as I sort of like went further down that road, I realized that there was a conversation that was missing. And the conversation that was missing was about like ADHD and relationships and how neurodivergency informs things like conversations around consent and, like sexual preferences and all of these different things. And the more that I looked, the more that I realized like there really wasn't a conversation that I felt like represented me and that I sort of fit into. And so I toiled in secret for a year, and I became a certified sex educator. And that experience, which I have a lot to say just about the actual like training itself, but that experience really solidified the fact that there were a lot of conversations that were missing, especially in the kink and BDSM community. And so I started talking about neurodivergency and kink and BDSM, and now my mom is mad. The end. Thumbs up.
I feel
and now
like
my mom's uncomfortable.
My long lost sister, like
all the time.
I think. Because
this
too was a late diagnosed, very academically successful, and when I told people I had ADHD when I had been diagnosed with it, everybody was like, that doesn't seem right. I was like, oh, did you go to medical school last week?
Right.
So anyway, sorry.
No, it's okay. I was also going to say that because of TikTok, I have found at least one long lost sister, so you could be the second.
Ooh.
True story. I found out I had a sister on TikTok. Yeah. It's like a weird trivia fact. That's it. That's the whole story.
You can't move on.
There's only like 2 billion users on TikTok, so it's
true,
obvious
right?
that you would find your sister. Yeah.
And then one of them reached out. They were like, "Hey, I'm your sister," and I was like, "Oh, cool." But the funny thing is, and this is a true story, is the movie The Parent Trap. When I watched that movie growing up, I very specifically remembered watching that movie, and I was like, "Yeah, that happens to everybody," because I've discovered a long lost sister I've had 3 long lost sisters at this point. But the first one I went to summer camp with when I was like 7 years old, and we were really good friends. And everybody kept telling us how much we looked alike, and we were always like, no. And I would always go, but I'm adopted. We can't look alike. And then it turned out that she was actually my sister. And so one of my weird trivia facts is that I've actually been parent trapped, and that's a true story about me. So there you go. Anyway, so
that's
ADHD
fantastic.
is cool.
Not anyway. What? 3?
So that's it.
So how many siblings did you think you had when you started, and how many do you have now?
Oh God. So when growing up, I grew up with a brother who was also adopted. So he was 6 months younger than me. So I thought I had one sibling. Then when I was 25 or 21, I found out that I had, my best friend from summer camp was my sister. So then that was 2. Then when I was 25, I found out that I had another sister, half sister. So that was 2 sisters. And then, I found out that then the sister that I met when I was 21, that she had 3 brothers and sisters. So at this point, I think I'm at like 6 or 7 if my math checks out. But I grew up with only 1, so it's been kind of a weird process.
It's a wild ride.
Wild ride.
I'd like to say I can't imagine, but I feel like I can, because I feel like it's always going to happen to me somehow. I don't know. That's how my grandpa was. He just drops kids, and we keep finding them. I'm up to like 17, 18 uncles and aunts that just pop up out of nowhere.
I mean, that's like family reunion would be a party, though.
I feel that so deep. What was it? Ancestry.com? I went on there and I learned some dirt about my dad's dad. Apparently things happened during the war that we never talked about. And so, yeah.
We don't talk about Bruno.
You guys remember the time that you had me on to talk about ADHD and sex, and I completely derailed it in minute 2?
How this all goes.
This is exactly how we want it, though. So
okay, good. Okay, good.
All we needed to really say is this show is about ADHD. Let's continue. Yeah.
And it's going to be a performance of it the entire time.
Yes.
That's great.
You said something that I thought was really interesting a moment ago that I want to capture, and that was that there wasn't conversations about consent and around neurodivergence. And off the top of my head, I go, how would that conversation be different than what I would understand to be the basic conversations around consent? Could you explain to us how consent might operate differently for neurodivergent people?
Absolutely. So first off, consent doesn't change. Like the foundational core concepts of consent doesn't change. But I think what needs to be in the conversation in order to make sure that the fundamental sort of basics of consent don't change are considerations in conversation with neurodivergency. A really good example is time blindness and memory issues that often come up with people with ADHD. Because for people with ADHD, a lot of times time either moves really quickly or really, really slowly, right? And so for some people, they might say, oh yeah, I would love to try X thing. And then, 2 weeks go by, and in their mind, it's been 8 months, and they completely forget about that conversation. And then their partner goes, surprise! And they try that thing, and they're like, whoa, what are you doing? And it's like, well, nobody was in the wrong. Nobody necessarily did anything bad. It was that there's a difference in time, a difference in memory. You didn't recall that conversation. Similarly, with consent, and again, talking about just sort of time blindness, when you get into sort of conversations about kink, kink can be especially like a sort of muddy waters if you're not really having hard conversations. Because the story that I always tell, and one of the reasons why I started talking about this and started really having these conversations, is that I did a scene with a guy, and I thought in my head 10, 15 minutes had gone by. It had actually been 45, about 50. And I still have the physical effects of that scene. Because I thought that he was keeping track of time. He thought that I was going to call it when it had been, long enough, quote unquote. And so it was one of those things where it was a massive miscommunication, but it was a communication that was grounded in my understanding of time. So I always like to be very clear. It's like consent doesn't change. Like neurodivergent people don't have different rules when it comes to consent. But what it comes down to is the fact that we need to often have an extra conversation about like, okay, if you consent to something, like, are you consenting right now? Are you consenting like for the future? How long into the future? What is a reasonable amount of time that I can like bring this up into the future? And so that's just time, and then you get to memory, and then you get to like rejection sensitivity, and then you get to executive dysfunction. And so like for every one of those sort of component parts, I'll just start ranting. So just stop me when you get bored.
I love it.
But for every one of those component parts, you really have to specifically have those conversations with your partner, and you have to be able to like know yourself well enough to say, okay, I struggle with memory, and like to the point of, I've had people reach out and say, I forget the safe word. What should I do? Like my memory is such that I often forget the safe word. And I say, well, then you have to have a secondary backup. You have to have something else. Like you cannot be safely playing in a situation like that in a scenario where you might forget the safe word. So it's stuff like that. So yeah, so consent doesn't change, but I think the considerations around consent change in order to keep people safe and supported, if that makes sense at all.
Yeah, it does.
I think that, first of all,
Totally.
if we stop you when you start getting boring, the entire episode will be you talking.
So it's like, surprise, Hamlet!
So I have a lot of thoughts, and I could keep talking. Do either of you have thoughts that you would like to say based on what just happened?
I have questions more than thoughts, because I'm like, I just want to like keep on getting information out. So if Jessica has thoughts, go for it.
Do I?
Or
have
I can go with
thought?
my questions.
I don't know if it's so much of a thought as like I'm really interested. I don't want to jump ahead if we have thoughts on this, but in how rejection sensitivity dysphoria can really harm you long term, especially if your partner is unaware of it, and especially in a society and culture in which oftentimes having sex with someone is kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Not disposable, but like very casual, right? And so like you might have sex with a partner, they do something, you experience that in a very strong way, and then, you guys go your separate ways, but that stays with you for so long, right?
Yeah.
Because the intensity of whatever happened that you felt rejected is so disproportionate. I don't even want to say disproportionate. It's just not equal to what other people would feel, or neurotypical people.
Can we get a working definition of rejection sensitivity for those for our listeners that aren't aware of these terms that we're using?
Sure. So a phenomenon that happens with, and it's a staggering number. I think the working number right now is about 95% of people with ADHD. But about, a large percentage of people with ADHD struggle with something called rejection sensitivity. And what that is basically a very strong visceral reaction to rejection. And this is important, real or perceived.
Yeah.
And so the example that I always use is that your boss sends you an email and he says, I need to talk to you tomorrow, period. Not an exclamation point, a period. For somebody without rejection sensitivity, they would read that email and go, okay, I wonder what the meeting's about. And then that would be the end of it, right? And then you go to the meeting.
For
a person with rejection sensitivity, that email could set off a spiral of, oh my God, I'm getting fired. My boss hates me. I'm a terrible person. I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to, like be on the streets, like whatever it may be, out of like that one minimal thing. And where rejection sensitivity comes from is the sort of universal experience of people with ADHD in being told over and over and over again that like we're doing it wrong, like we're not doing it enough, like if we just tried harder, if we just did it better, if we just were this, if we just were that. And so our brain starts pattern matching, because neurodivergent people are extremely good at pattern matching. And so we say, okay, well, one time, we got that email and that email was bad. So therefore every single email is going to be bad. But the thing that I always really like to clarify about rejection sensitivity is that it's not a diagnosable thing yet. There's a lot of conversation about actually adding it into the DSM as like a separate thing that like you could go be evaluated for. But right now, rejection sensitivity is more like if you went to the doctor and you said, I have a runny nose, a cough, a fever, and the chills, and, I just feel like ass. Your doctor would go, oh, you have the flu. That's what rejection sensitivity is. It is a sort of like collection of trauma symptoms that have developed over the experiences of living with neurodivergency that we collectively refer to as rejection sensitivity in order to sort of discuss it more efficiently. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes. So what I heard you say is that this is not rejection sensitivity is not because people are ADHD. Rejection sensitivity is because people with ADHD experience pattern matching and traumas in a certain pattern consistently throughout their life.
It's actually kind of up in the air. Like right now, the sort of general understanding of it is that it is mostly out of sort of like the trauma of constantly sort of like getting in trouble and that kind of stuff. But what's really interesting is that out of this sort of like conversation about the sort of trauma of being neurodivergent, there's come a separate conversation about people who said, well, that never really happened to me. That was never really a thing. Like I had the supports, I had the structures, I had the things in place, but I still also struggle with this. And so one of the reasons why there's a lot of conversation about whether or not it should go into the DSM is because we're sort of like opening that conversation about, are we inherently more susceptible to rejection, or is it because of the trauma that we experience? So I don't know. I'm just a nerd on the internet, but it's really interesting, and I'm really, really excited to see where it goes, because there's a lot of conversation about it right now.
I'm glad you said that, actually, because I'm in that boat that you just mentioned of not having that trauma. Like, I'm not officially ADD or anywhere necessarily, but I believe I'm on the spectrum. I haven't been diagnosed. Mm-hmm. I'm like on an ADD med right now, and it's actually working, so we might go into that area. But I never really had any performance issues as a kid. I never really had any academic issues as a kid. And yet I still have rejection sensitivity very strongly, even with that whole support system.
I think
it's really interesting.
A very different experience, right? I guess we had a similar experience where I actually did quite well in school and had a lot of positive reinforcement. And it wasn't necessarily I needed to do better. I'm trying to think of how to phrase it. It wasn't like that I was being told that I needed to do better, but I certainly felt this pressure to be a perfectionist. Like I needed everything to go right. I needed to be in control of it. And I think something, not with you, but something that can get lost with a lot of people is sort of the overlap and comorbidities that appear with ADHD, right? So like I had a very traumatic childhood. So that meant that like I was anxious and I was depressed, which then led to often feeling like an outsider and just feeling like I didn't really fit in anywhere. And I'm not a doctor, like you said, I'm just a nerd on the internet. But it's interesting to think about how those experiences of being of not quite feeling like you fit can sort of reinforce this idea that people don't like you, or that you're doing something wrong, or that if your friend can't hang out today, it's because they hate you and they never want to see you again. Like things like that, right? So it's interesting to try and parse some of that apart, because I was originally diagnosed with chronic depression and anxiety, and I took medication for that for a long time, and it helped to a degree, but it wasn't really addressing the root problem. Was just that I felt very aimless, couldn't focus on anything, couldn't keep my brain in one spot, put my fucking keys in the fridge, like just, I couldn't, like, and I just felt like a bird brain, right? Because I had been so successful in so many ways. And then like, I'm an adult and I'm like, why am I not able to do the shit that I was doing before? And I think it's because as an adult, our tasks become so much more rote and like, there's so much more routine to our life. I'm rambling. But that like it became very hard for me to do like adult daily tasks because I hated them. So my brain was just like, just forget about those.
So, a direction that I think might be interesting for this, because we've been talking a little bit about kink. We talked a little bit about sexual education. So just on the foundations of relationships in general, I don't feel like... So as someone that was diagnosed with ADHD at a very early age, and I was in the school of thought where, like, we're just going to medicate the fuck out of some kids and hope for the best. Like, I was on that side of the conversation.
Hell yeah, brother.
And so I was on tons of, way too much drugs. Very, very early, like 11, 12. And then was weaned off of them by, like, I did it myself as an adult. I still don't feel like I got an education around the thing that I was being diagnosed with. And so I feel, and perhaps this is just my experience, maybe it's not, that there is a barrier in being educated around neurodivergence altogether. And there is a barrier around really helpful conversations around sexual education. And so it feels like there's a barrier around all of these conversations. So how do we break the seal on this to give people access to this information so they can have good, good, connected, consensual relationships with their neurodivergent partners?
I mean, that's such
that was a big one. I just asked you to
question.
fix the world. I'm aware of that.
I appreciate it because I think like asking the question is still acknowledging the problem. You know what I mean? Because the real truth is like there is not one perfect fix. And one of the most frustrating things for me is like the reason I got into all of this in the first place was because of exactly that. Like I, walked into the office, the doctor's office, literally convinced that I had early onset dementia because I had no idea what was going on. But my whole life I had been taught over and over that like ADHD is for little kids who can't sit still and who are like failing out of school. And I had a very uninformed and very like a stereotypical view of ADHD. And it wasn't until after my diagnosis that I started realizing how fundamentally lacking like my understanding of ADHD was as a person who had been living with it my entire life. But then I started talking to people. And I started hearing the same stories over and over and over again of, in particular, like women in their, 30s and 40s and 50s who had very similar experiences to me, but they get told, you're too smart to have ADHD. You get too good of grades to have ADHD, or, you make really good eye contact, so you can't be autistic, or you're too pretty to be autistic. That's one that I literally have heard from like multiple people. It's shocking. And this is what they're hearing from their diagnostic professionals, that like you get good grades, therefore we're going to completely eliminate the ability for you to have this thing. And so there's so much misinformation at the diagnostic level. There's a ton of issues in diagnosing. And then don't even get me started on like the inherent like just racism and sexism in just the research of ADHD, because oh my God, we don't have 17 hours. But so like there's a lot of problems. And so that's kind of why I started talking, because my thought was, well, I'm a person who doesn't look like the 7-year-old boy who's like fucking around in the back of the classroom, but I'm still just as valid. Like my story is just as true as that 7-year-old boy. And so then like slowly, I kind of started building this community around like people who had similar experiences to me. And so I guess like I don't have a good answer on how to fix the world, but from my perspective, I think one of the most productive things and one of the healthiest things and one of the most powerful things that we can do is just talk about our own experiences and just say ADHD doesn't look just like this. ADHD looks like me. Autism looks like you, or whatever it may be, and starting there and really bringing awareness to the lack of understanding and the lack of conversations about those challenges, if that makes sense, kind of.
Yeah.
You just made a connection for me about my childhood that I'm going to need to talk to my therapist about. So thank you for that.
Thanks, I guess.
Sorry.
The bill is in the mail, by the way.
No, I was raised in a household where I was often told that I wasn't smart. And I thought that it was just because of my parents, and now I'm figuring out, oh my goodness, yes, there's this stigma around ADHD, and my parents were told I had it, and so they probably got this hint from the diagnostic individuals that I wasn't going to, like, I had never thought about that.
Yeah.
And now I'm going to be thinking about that.
Yeah,
when
it's really common.
Which is crazy because
really
you're
common.
intelligent. You're one of the most intelligent people I know, and it's hard to imagine.
Well, and I think that's a really interesting... I'm going to probably stumble over this, but thinking you're not smart because your brain works differently, or being told that you're not smart because your brain works differently. God, I feel like this sounds like I'm tooting my own horn, but like, my brain frustrates the hell out of me. Like, when I'm trying to do something, so like, for instance, we'll have a topic on this show, and they'll be like, you need to research this, and I'll be like, sounds good, and then I get off here, and I'm like, I'm never going to research that, sounds boring, and then my brain doesn't do it, right? But if I'm interested in something, there is nobody that will be more thorough than I am in exploring that topic, presenting that topic, like, all of that, right? And so when I am into something, people will be like, you're brilliant. But if I'm not into it, like, I probably just look like a lazy dumbass, like, to be honest, because, like, they're like, why can't you just pull this up on Google? And I'm like, I just can't. Like, I don't know, I just can't. Anyway.
Now that's tied to executive dysfunctions, right?
Yes.
Yes?
I think so.
Is that correct? So how would executive dysfunctions alter the way we might need to talk about romantic relationships or sexual relationships?
How long do you have?
Apparently,
Why do we have?
everyone hear that chuckle? That was great.
How long do you have is the real question.
I have precisely 1 hour. But I mean, the real truth is that ADHD looks different on everybody. And there are some people who are really, really good at certain executive functions, and they're really, really bad at other ones. And so, like, it's not a spectrum as though it is, like, related to autism, but it is a spectrum disorder in that everybody with it has different, strengths and weaknesses. And so with that comes in a dramatic and very, oh God, I don't even know the right word to say, like, yes, a lot to how it can affect relationships. Because, for some people, like, it can be something as simple as, task initiation. Like, they really struggle with, like, starting the task. Well, sending a text message is a task. Responding to an email is a task. Buying flowers because it's your anniversary is who feels called out? Raise your hand.
Yeah, I was like, I feel personally attacked. Like, I need to go.
You know what I mean?
About what I've done.
And so that's the thing. But the same thing, like, the same thing is, like, object permanence is one that's kind of difficult to talk about because, like, we are not Labrador retrievers. Like, we know that, if, like, the ball moves off screen, it still exists. But our brain doesn't really differentiate between, the bottle cap or, your grandma or your boyfriend. And so, like, people can struggle really hard in, like, long distance relationships because literally out of sight, out of mind can apply to people. And even with emotions, like emotional permanence, like, I feel loved when I am with this person, but the minute that they go, do they like me? Do they actually like me? Was it all just a... I'm watching you guys react. I'm like, is everybody okay? Like,
no,
do we need to take a moment?
Yeah, everyone breathe. Everyone.
And so it's tons of stuff. It's tons of stuff all the time. And then, when you get to even, again, to, like, bring it back to, like, sex or something like that, like, if you are a person who skews to the kinky, like, just the silliest one that I can think of.
Just like, it couldn't be any of us, but, like,
couldn't be me. But, if you're a person who skews to the kinky, like, what do you do when you lose the key to the handcuffs? like that kind of stuff where it's like, and it can be so frustrating and so embarrassing, but it's like, these are real things that people struggle with. Like the embarrassment of like, I have misplaced the key. Like, great. Like, I'm such a fuck up, So sexy. So yeah, I mean, it's the thing that I get really hung up on, or I guess like soapboxy about, is that there's this really prevalent notion that, first off, like ADHD like magically disappears on your 18th birthday. Like it's just like, you're an adult, you're cured, congratulations. And that's of course obviously not the case. But even more than that, like there's such this idea that ADHD is about work. It's about chores. It's about, your schoolwork or whatever it may be. But it's always like sort of like task oriented. But we don't think about like the relationship tasks, the task maintenance of a relationship. And so it's like ADHD is I think deeply insidious. It is deeply insidious, and it is deeply ingrained in everything that we do, is every single thing, and so yeah, like I guess my answer is yes, it affects relationships.
I mean, I think it's partially why I had so much trouble, still do, maintaining friendships.
Yeah.
And I don't know about...
It can be really hard.
Yeah.
Really hard.
People, like, I'm very well known among my friend group for just never responding to anything. And if you need me, you really have to, like, try to get to me multiple times. And then I feel bad. And then because I feel bad, I'm like, well, shit, now it's been 5 days, so I guess I can just never talk to that person again. Like, yep. Good knowing you.
Like, and it's so interesting too, because like once you start looking at like the statistics of the effects of ADHD, like teenage girls with ADHD are like 70% more likely to self-harm. Most girls with ADHD have been sexually assaulted by the time that they're 18 or 19. Like there are these like profound effects that ADHD has on relationships, like especially in conversation with things like impulse control, and that kind of stuff. And so like making dangerous choices because it seems like a really good idea at the time, and so because of that, like, one of the reasons why I really started talking about sex, like as a sex educator, was because of how many times, like looking back, like I could have gotten hurt, or I made a really risky choice, or I made a really damaging choice, or I made just like a very, very uninformed choice. Because at the time my impulse control was like, it's a great idea,
what could go wrong?
Like, yeah, exactly. And so yeah, so like it's so big and it's so much to talk about that it's hard to even sort of like pull the thread, because it immediately gets knotted with like all of the different, places where it like sort of spider webs out, I guess.
I'm just watching Andrew's face.
I've got so much. I should have started taking notes on just like, shit, that's a good thing. I need it. Like, okay.
He needs a second therapist.
I do. Also, okay, something that I learned throughout relationships is the notion of like maintenance and how that applies to gender, and how it is often laid in many circles or in many like monogamous relationships where the tasks of the maintenance of the relationship is often falls to the woman as opposed to the male. That's just tends to happen in a lot of cases, in a lot of patriarchal relationships. So I'm neurodivergent, my wife is neurodivergent, and she has felt, by all the structures around us, the pressure to do certain kind of maintenance in the relationship. We also have a child. That has applied to certain kind of notions of maintenance in the relationship. Then you throw in things like executive dysfunction. Yeah. And you throw in things like issues with memory. I don't have a good question for this, but I'm that just notion of like how gender in relationships, in like straight passing relationships, might, and the patriarchal structures that are imposed on our relationships might be extra difficult on neurodivergent women.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely can be. What's really interesting is over on TikTok, which is where I spend a lot of my time these days. There's been a really interesting conversation about weaponized incompetence, and how weaponized incompetence affects like so many, couples, where the guy's like, I don't know how to do laundry. I can't ever do the laundry. It's so hard. I don't know how to do it. Oh no. And it's like, bro, YouTube is free, right?
The incompetence. Love it.
Right, the incompetence. But the other side of that is that there is also a very real thing that happens with like many neurodivergent people in terms of like just taking laundry, for example, because task organization and task initiation can be something that they struggle with, where if you give a person more than say like 2 or 3 instructions at a time, they will lose track. They will, mix them up. They'll do them in the wrong order. And so it can be really frustrating as a neurodivergent partner, regardless of your gender, who is like really trying and you really do want to contribute, but your executive function gets in the way. And it's like, no, laundry really is really difficult for me. For me, it's folding laundry. I'll do laundry all day, but like my laundry will stay on a pile in front of the dryer until it is dirty again. And so that can be really challenging to navigate through that. And so for a lot of neurodivergent couples, the thing that I always come down to is that like, and it sounds so silly, but it's like communication, but the communication, like, it's like so easy to be like, oh, have you considered talking to each other? Which is like, yes, obviously. But the communication really has to be grounded in a realistic understanding of who you are. And that can be so scary. And that can be so vulnerable. And that can be really, really hard to look at somebody and say, I love you more than anything else in the entire world, but I'm not going to be able to do the dishes tonight. I'm too depressed, or I'm in too much pain, or whatever it may be. And internalizing that and internalizing the shame and guilt of like what we are taught, and, to kind of gender it a little bit, but, with this idea that like the woman is the homemaker. And so it's like, well, I can't do the dishes, or I really struggle to do the laundry. I must be a bad wife. I must be a bad partner. There must be something inherently wrong with me, and everybody else in the entire world can do this stuff, but I can't. I'm at fault. I am broken. And that's so fundamentally not true. And so that's why communication is key. That's why negotiation is key. That is why finding places to say, hey, I'm weak in this area, but you are strong in this area. Let's compromise. But it can be really hard. It takes a really long time, especially for late diagnosed people who might not even really know what is or is not based in their neurodivergency, to know what to ask for, or even, something that literally my husband is working through right now, how to ask for what he needs, because you might not have that. You might not have those skills. And that is a skill that you have to specifically develop and specifically work on with every partner that you have. So, yeah.
I would like to ask you a question. Sorry, Andrew.
No, just kidding. You're fine.
People should really talk.
So, I'm asking for a friend, obviously. What are your thoughts on ADHD and non-monogamy?
I have very strong opinions, but full transparency, I'm exceptionally biased because I do have multiple partners. But
Same.
One of the things that I really dislike, and it has gotten to the point where like it has become like a bone of like contention with me, is that a lot of people go, oh, I'm ADHD and I get bored quickly. Yeah. Therefore, non-monogamy must be for me.
No.
And holy shit, is that toxic and problematic and not okay for so many different reasons. And so it's like, I think that in many, many cases, I'm not here to, recruit you to my team. I think monogamy works for some people and non-monogamy works for other people, but everybody involved obviously needs to be on the same page. But I think I don't think it matters if you have ADHD or not. Because at the end of the day, yes, having multiple partners may allow you in conversation with ADHD. Like in my case, my husband supports me in very specific ways, and my partner, Eric, supports me in very different ways. And so that's great for my ADHD. But I didn't seek out multiple partners because I was bored of one.
Right.
Because that is so deeply unethical that it makes me like itchy to say it. Like I'm not bored of my husband. That is not why I chose to open my heart to a second partner. It's because I loved him. And I think that there's enough love to go around. But there's a lot of like weird conversation on TikTok about how like non-monogamy is perfect for ADHD people because we don't pay attention to stuff. And it's like, what the fuck are you talking about? Do you know how much more complicated it's all Google schedules. It's just Google calendars all the way down. Like, what are you talking about? It's twice as hard. Come on.
What was the meme that I saw the other day that was like, polyamory is just people that have a scheduling kink?
Seriously. It's like, I'm just here for the D&D party, man.
You're not wrong.
But like that, yeah, you're not wrong. But yeah, it's like, but I mean, I think it's like, it's true whether or not you're talking about monogamy or non-monogamy. Like at the end of the day, like whoever you are involved with is a person. You know, they're a human being with thoughts and feelings and emotions. And so it's like, if your solution to being bored is to go collect another partner, like you are setting yourself up for so much hurt and so much disaster. And so a lot of times like ADHD folks will come to me and be like, should I be non-monogamous? And I go, well, why? And then that's where we start. But yeah, I think like if it works, great. If it doesn't, also great. Like I think it's a very much like private, personal decision.
Yeah.
So before I forget to say this, you made a video a while back that you may or may not remember, where you were a character and so was your psyche, like who was walking in the room observing you, and you were having sex, right? And you were like, "Oh my gosh, you're having sex! That's great!" And then it's just like, and then in the conversation you were having with yourself, you were then focusing on other thoughts and other sounds and other things, and not your partner, and you were guilty about it. You felt guilty. Do you remember this video?
I honestly don't, but I believe you that I made it.
It was your ADHD roommate video number 1, and I know that because I just watched it before we got on camera.
Is it ADHD? Okay.
Yeah, you noticed the ceiling fan in the middle.
Okay, I got you. Thank you.
For some reason, the line where you're like, "Oh my gosh, are we having sex? That's great!" Like that line just. So that
all
video,
of a sudden, I've noticed cracks in the ceiling.
Well, that video was the first time as a man with ADHD that I heard someone articulate in a way that I could understand that when I get distracted or bored or whatever during sex, it's not because I love my partner less.
No.
And like, thank you for what you're doing, because you created a very meaningful conversation in my relationship. And yeah, before I forget to say that, that was just so important for me and my wife to talk about, and realize that neurodivergence was affecting our sex life, and we didn't know. We had no fucking clue until like CatieOsaurus walked in the room and decided to change up everything with her internal monologue. So now you know that I feel that, and I don't know where the episode will go from there.
Well, thank you.
Yeah,
that's fine. I mean, first off, watch me get super uncomfortable. Like, one of my favorite things is sometimes in interviews that will happen is somebody will say something really nice, then I get super self-conscious and I have to be like, "Oh, deflect!"
I feel like I'm watching myself talk. It's very uncomfortable. Yeah, I'm not gonna lie.
But I mean, that's like one of the first places that I start when I talk about neurodivergency and sex. And I have a very specific story that I tell. So I will tell it now. You're welcome. But so when I was in class for my sex educator certification, I was taking a class and it was taught by this guy who was clearly not neurodivergent. And we were having a conversation about like normalizing like interruptions during sex, and like, because a lot of times like there's this like idea that sex has to be this like perfect magical thing and nothing will ever go wrong, you know, and whatever. And so he was like kind of like talking about that and how to address that if a couple feels, you know, bad. And basically the answer is it's normal. It happens. But during that class, he said something very specific and it stuck with me. He said, "The moment is not precious. You don't have to worry about it. The moment is not precious. You can always come back." And I was sitting there going like, what the fuck are you talking about, like, yes, the moment is precious. Every single moment of my life is precious. Because, like, if the ceiling fan starts clicking or my neighbor starts mowing his lawn, like, which he does, by the way, like 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, that man has a fetish. I'm convinced. It's fine. But, like, thinking about, like, all of the times that I had that happen, where I got bored, or I checked out, or the ceiling fan started clicking, or the air conditioning turned on, or, like, the music was, like, had weird lyrics that didn't make sense to have sex to, or whatever. All of those things, like, in that moment, just immediately took me out of it, and immediately, like, like, that feeling of, like, it's gone. I'm not into it anymore. I'm distracted. I'm out of focus. And, like, having to look at somebody who you love very much and go, I'm so sorry. The fan is making a noise, so we have to stop. Like, it can be humiliating, and it can be embarrassing, and it can really create a lot of guilt and shame and resentment around your neurodivergency. And so one of the things that I always really like to talk about is, like, your brain doesn't distinguish between, like, a chicken sandwich and having sex. And so you're just as likely to get distracted while making that sandwich as you are, like, to stretch the metaphor past the breaking point, making love. Like, it's the same thing. It's still a task. It's still, add mayonnaise, or, oh, I'm sorry, I'll stop. But, like, it's like one of those things, And so it's like, so many times, like, I start the conversation with, it is normal to have a moment where you check out, and it is not a commentary on you. It is not a commentary on your relationship. It is not a commentary on your partner. It is not a commentary on anything except your brain's shitbag inability to direct its attention. But unlearning just how much, and then this is a whole separate rant, so I'll keep it short, but, like, unlearning the toxic ideals that we are taught in our culture about what love is and what romance is, and, like, well, if he loved me, he would just know. I shouldn't have to ask for what I want. He should just be able to read my mind, and everybody is ready for sex at the drop of a hat, and there doesn't need to be any sort of, like, warm up. We can just jump in the closet and bone, but because those are the messages that we get, it really is, you know what I mean? But because of that, because those are the messages that we get on TV, and it's like, and it makes sense. Like, we can't, like, if a show devoted 25 minutes to the conversation about consent and foreplay, it would be a very long show, and it probably wouldn't be very interesting to watch. And so they don't show that. And so there's just this, like, really unhealthy notion that sex is, like, perfect and like, intricate and very, like, well designed all the time. Yeah. And it's the exact opposite thing as true. So, well,
it very much feels like sex is shown to us as, like, a script, right? Like, this is how it should go every time. This is what sex is. And if it doesn't fit these, like, points, then it's not good. You did it wrong. Yeah. And I think especially for someone who has an issue, like, rejection sensitivity, and feels like I'm always doing something wrong, it's compounded when you then feel like, in this very vulnerable, very intimate situation, you've done something wrong. And now it's like, oh shit.
Yeah. Well, and even, like, speaking more to that, like, about 40% of people with ADHD, regardless of gender, struggle to orgasm. Like, it is just a fact. And, that in itself, like, when orgasm is, like, the goal, like, it's the thing that has to happen or it doesn't count and it's not real sex. Because that is the narrative that we're sold so often. Again, like, it results in a lot of, like, internalized shame and embarrassment and guilt and resentment and what's wrong with me, and, why doesn't my partner like me enough to come, or, like, whatever it may be. And so, again, that's kind of why I do what I do, is because, like, I can't, teach everybody in the world, but I can at least, teach a few people at a time.
Just like a million.
But then well, nobody sees the sex videos. That's TikTok's favorite thing, is they'll show everybody the shit posts, but they won't show anybody the educational stuff. Yeah.
And this can also be compounded by medication that one is taking. So I know, for instance, I take an antidepressant, Zoloft, and then the ADHD medication that I'm trying right now is this, it's like the Wellbutrin quick release or something. Mm-hmm. And it just doesn't always happen if I'm having sex that come. And and you know, hello internet, now you all know about me.
We're on the same mix too. I'm like, hey.
Oh my god, hey.
Zoloft Wellbutrin, what's up?
Yeah.
Can we acknowledge that Wellbutrin quick release is probably the best name, considering we're talking about not being able to come?
It's true. I'm also team Wellbutrin, so it's good.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, like, of all the medications that have all the side effects, like, I feel like I'm on a pretty good balance, because it's not like I absolutely can't ever, and it doesn't have some of the other side effects, like being lethargic or gaining a bunch of weight or losing a bunch of weight or whatever. But I think I know personally that in the past, like, men have made me feel bad because I didn't finish. Bitch, sounds like a you problem. No, I'm just kidding. No, not really.
I mean, but, I love that you say that, because like medication is one facet. And also the other thing that I need to, like, I feel like I have to say is that I am just talking about ADHD. But there are the top 5 comorbidities to ADHD are depression, anxiety, sleep disorders, like issues with like substance use disorder, like eating disorders, that kind of thing, and sexual disappointments and dysfunctions.
Okay, bye.
But so when you start looking at stuff like how many people with ADHD also have depression or also have anxiety, it becomes an entirely whole, huge, gigantic other conversation about how ADHD and depression can sort of like stack on top of each other to make the situation even more complicated. And then you talk about stuff like medication, and you talk about stuff like, you know, like even like sleep and how sleep can affect like your libido and that kind of stuff. Like it becomes like, you know, you start with like the little tiny thing and it just becomes this gigantic ball, like just mess of yarn so quickly. But yeah, I love that you said that, because you're exactly right. Like medication is for some people a big part of it.
Yeah. And I'm curious, if y'all don't mind, I never sleep. But I'm wondering, like, since we're all here diagnosed, like, do any of you struggle with sleep, or is it just my insomniac ass?
I've been sleeping like 2 hours a night since they just changed my meds, so...
Yeah.
I'm glad.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
About, like, the statistics are, like, it's really interesting, because, like, some studies say, like, 50 to 60, some studies say, like, 75 to 90, and one study literally was, like, 100%. So it really depends on, like, where you're looking. But one of the things that really affects people with ADHD is delayed sleep phase syndrome, which is where if your partner goes to bed at 12, we'll say midnight, it will take like a person without delayed sleep phase issues between like 30 minutes to fall asleep. For somebody with ADHD who's also dealing with like the sleep phase stuff, it can be up to 3 hours. And across the board, statistically, we see that it's almost universally 2 to 3 hours difference between like a normal sleep schedule and somebody with like delayed sleep phase, which is really challenging, again, because when you talk about relationships, and this is a big thing, and I don't mind sharing this, like, it really impacts me and my husband, because my husband is one of those people who can fall asleep in like 5 minutes, just head hits the pillow, he's done. And it's also really important to him that we go to sleep together. Yeah. But then I have this like really awkward like 3 hour window where I'm bored out of my fucking mind, because I know that's important to him that I'm in the bed, but I'm like, I'm awake and I'm bored and I need something to do. And so like I ultimately solved it. I bought like a little reading light that's like, it's like you wear it like a necklace, and I can point it away from him and I can just like read my book until I get sleepy. But like it can so specifically impact relationships, and just a feeling of disconnection, and a feeling of feeling like far away from your partner, and feeling like, you know, you're like off and like you don't match your partner. And it's not your fault. Like it literally just is part of ADHD, is the phenomenon that it takes us longer to fall asleep. And when we do fall asleep, we often wake up much more easily. And we often wake up exhausted, and we often don't get as good of quality of sleep as people without ADHD. And so it's like, when you're tired all the time, you're not necessarily like super excited to bang, you know? But again, it's like, it just compounds. It just stacks. It just keeps growing and gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So there you go.
I know personally, I can pass out usually if I'm tired, but I wake up. And then, I wake up at 2 a.m. and I'm just awake.
Yep. Yeah.
For a while, it was every morning at 3 a.m. I'm awake. Then it was 2. All of a sudden, it became 1. And I was like, fuck me running. Like, we're just moving backwards here. And it's weird because I'll get a bunch of work done, but I'm just exhausted all of the time. So you feel like you're being productive, but you're also dead on your feet. And it's this very weird, I don't know, tension maybe. Like, it's a strange feeling.
Also, Andrew, are you okay? You look like you're going through it, man. I'm worried about you.
First of all,
you just came on the show and told us all about ourselves. Like,
I just read you to filth.
Yes, to the boots.
No, what's happening here is, I think, I am exhibiting in live form what I think this episode will do for a lot of people, which is and I mean that the best way. No. It'll give them language for things that they have dealt with their entire lives and felt guilty about the way that's affected relationships. Like, we deal with so many things on this podcast that have to do with, like, how the social milieu has created certain religious structures, political structures, so forth. With this conversation, we haven't addressed it yet, but like purity culture and tied to ADHD, tied to depression, tied to all these different things that you've mentioned, tied to capitalism and how that utilitarian view of the human person and like all of these layers have happened on relationships and our ability to have any kind of meaningful relationship. And we barely know fuck all, most of us, about any of it, right?
Yup. So
I think what I'm experiencing right now is I'm going, oh, this is a lot of layers. How would, as a person raised in a patriarchal structure and a capitalist society under purity culture with ADHD and depression, what would you say to like because people like me are going to be listening to this, right?
Yeah.
And what gives you hope for other people and their relationships that prompts you to continue doing this work?
I mean, the real truth is that, you just described me. Like, I grew up in a super religious, very Catholic household where, masturbation was a sin and being gay was a sin. And I remember very specifically going to my mom when I was 11 and I said, Mom, like, I've been thinking a lot about it and I like women. And she said, no, you don't. And I said, well, she's my mom. She must know better than me. And so then for the next, 8 years, I labored under this assumption that, like, at some point that feeling would go away. My mom must be right, but God hates gay people, so what am I supposed to do?
Will
so I just
you
gotta be quiet about
please
this.
come back on our show and can we talk about that? Please.
Yes, I would be delighted.
Thank you.
But so I grew up with that. I grew up being deeply ashamed of my body. I grew up deeply ashamed of being, attracted to all genders. I grew up just deeply ashamed of who I was, and it wasn't until, honestly, much later than you might think, college at least, where I at least started realizing that, like, it was not, it didn't matter who I loved, like, I was still a good person. I was still a valuable person, that, like, some arbitrary rule about whether or not I could love women, like, who gives a fuck, and then similarly, like, one of the reasons why I really started getting interested in sex and sexuality was that I didn't know what a vulva was until I was 22. nobody had ever taught me that word because your body was, your body was, shameful and gross and, was not to be explored, and you were not to masturbate. Masturbating was a sin. And so like I had a vagina, like I knew that.
Just one piece.
And then it's just one piece. It's just like one, you just click on unit, But that honestly, but like I love school. I love school.
Me too.
I love learning. I love research. My thing is like, my fucking kink is academia. You know what I mean? And so that was the point where I just was like, what else don't I know about my own body? Like, what else don't I know about this vessel that people keep telling me is sacred, and they keep telling me is a gift from this guy who apparently doesn't want me to know anything about it, and also doesn't want me to enjoy it, and also doesn't want me to like love the people that I want to love in order to help me enjoy my body. I'm confused. And so yeah, I completely forgot the question, but that's, I guess, the end of this. But
no, that was the right answer. You got it.
But yeah, but like that's why I do it, is because I don't ever want anybody to feel as broken and as alone and as fucked up and scared and weird and like they don't fit in, for the sake of something as simple as you have ADHD and it's going to be hard for you to come sometimes, or, you have ADHD and you're going to struggle to keep your room clean, but that doesn't mean that you're a bad person. And it doesn't mean that you're like a failure. It just means that you have executive dysfunction issues. So that's why I do it. 'Cause I just don't want people to feel like I did growing up. Honestly.
So like, we're all crying, right? All of us.
I love how all of us repressed kids are like out here trying to fight trauma. I think it's beautiful.
Like, please. Take it. I
think it's beautiful that like knowing Jegaysus and knowing Queen of Heathens, they have talked in light form on a number of occasions about practicing conversations that they would not have been able to have as kids. And I feel very similarly. I'm just really excited that we got to have an episode tonight with a room filled with people that are working really hard to make life easier for the younger versions of themselves that are existing in the world. And for an episode filled to the brim with sex and coming and all this different stuff, the nookie, with the nookie, that was a surprisingly wholesome place to land on, I think. That we're all just here, for the kids.
For the kids.
I get compared to Mr. Rogers a lot. Like, it's a weird thing. I get compared to Mr. Rogers at least like a dozen times a day, and I'm always just like, oh god, they're gonna find out that I have an OnlyFans, and then I'm gonna just disappoint everybody. I'm a very different person on OnlyFans. Go to my OnlyFans.
Yeah.
CatieOsaurus. It's not me, it's my evil twin Schmatey. But like, it's just, but that's the thing too, is like unpacking that and the idea that like, I blow minds when people find out that I have an OnlyFans. And I'm like, wait till you find out it's how I make my living. But it's this idea that like, you can be the wholesome, like, ADHD and you're not broken and you're not alone, which I absolutely am. And I absolutely stand for that. But I also like to fuck, And so it's unpacking that and really working towards that as well, as just making people aware that like you can be wholesome as fuck and still like sex, and it doesn't negate your wholesomeness. It doesn't negate, the work that you're doing in whatever sphere you're advocating or educating in. It just means that you're a person who is like,
it just means you're a person.
Appreciates sex. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We all contain multitudes, but I think that this idea that like if you're wholesome, you can't also enjoy sex is based on this idea that sex is bad somehow.
Yeah.
Like
I think it's wholly grounded in purity culture,
Exactly. Or like at least Puritans. But if we just accepted like sex is actually a good thing, it is, then it wouldn't be this weird like, well, I do both. They're separate. Like, it's a normal human function. And I'm saying this like I behave in that way. I also am like still struggling with that relationship. But I think like saying it out loud to remind people that like we've been taught that sex is bad. Therefore, well, in any number of ways, right? very subtle ways, very overt ways. We've been taught that it's bad, and if you like it, you're a slut, you're bad, and like da-da-da-da-da. When in reality, like, it's normal. We've attached some weird meanings to it, but like being wholesome and liking sex are not mutually exclusive. Like,
Precisely.
You're just a person.
Right?
That's so good. I think that, and I think I just exhibited that tendency, but I have this tendency in my head to like associate wholesome with like anything that would go in a G movie. And if it wouldn't go in a G movie, it's not wholesome. And I think it's just like programming to a certain point that I haven't fully been able to erase yet. That
it's hard.
We're allowed to be whole functioning adults in all the ways that people can be adults for our species. And that's still wholesome. That's still good. That's not bad. That's interesting. I'm going to have to think about that more.
I think it's, I mean, not to, soapbox, but like, I think it's more wholesome, honestly. Like, I think embracing sexuality and embracing, your body and what you enjoy, like there's a vulnerability to that, and there's a self-awareness to that I think is honestly deeply wholesome, because
it makes you more
it's saying, it's saying like I am worthy of love. I am worthy of, affection,
pleasure.
I'm honoring my needs. I'm honoring my wants. And out of that, like, I think it really allows you to be a better, kinder, nicer person, because you're not repressing those feelings. You're not punishing yourself for feeling like a bad person. You're not sitting there going like, oh, what's wrong with me? Like, I think really embracing, everything that you're into, whether it be sex or not, or whatever it may be, I think embracing all of you is what allows the wholesomeness to like really exist, because you are being authentically yourself in the kindest and most compassionate way you can. Because that's what wholesome is to me. It's kindness and compassion and authentically representing who you are.
Yeah, and I also
just
think
a thought
that like when you punish yourself, you might think you're just doing it inward, but ultimately you reflect that outward in some way. Because if you're shaming yourself, you will ultimately shame somebody else because they liked something that you haven't brought yourself to reckon with, or to understand that there is no good or bad values attached to these acts. It's simply what you're comfortable with versus what you're not. And that's it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so I think we're I was going to say we're probably wrapping up, but Andrew looks like he has something to say. All I want to say is please come back, because I think we have a lot more to discuss.
I would love to. I'm sorry that I'm sorry that it's girls. It's actually really funny that we're talking about like, accepting your like wants and needs, is because literally I'm doing like my therapy homework. My therapist told me that I need to like hang out with my friends more. So like we're having like wine night tonight. So like that's where I'm going to after this.
No, it's good. We try to keep it around an hour anyway, so no apologies necessary, but like we would be forever indebted to you if you came back.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But Andrew, what were you going to ask?
So your content in general, as soon as I got on TikTok, was something that made me reflect on myself in a way that very few other people have, and I deeply appreciate your brain and your capacity to communicate. And getting to have you in long form right now has fucked me up.
I hope in a good way.
In the best way.
Can we please be friends? I just would
That's basically what I'm saying right now.
I would be honored.
I'm translating, and for myself as well. But
yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that, because I don't word well when I have big feelings. You have given me so much to think about on how I relate to my own body, and how I relate to my partner's body, and how I relate to my partner's experiences, and how I think about all of those things in this like strange conversation about virtues, morals, and for myself also conversations around spirituality. I'm sure that this episode will do a lot of that for other people as well. So I just wanted to just very explicitly say thank you for being wholesome, being your whole self.
Thanks for having me.
Here. Yeah.
I really
appreciate you
it.
for being part of our healing journey.
Yes, thank you. Is that your Jesus shirt that you're wearing right now?
It is my Jesus shirt. I wore it for you.
Thank you.
I wore it for
Okay.
you.
Because
like,
everyone was tagging me in your video. They're like, Jegaysus. And I was like, I'm literally talking to her in 30 minutes, so.
I also saw that and I was like, oh, fuck, I forgot to follow you back. Fuck.
All good.
I promise I'll follow you back. I'm sorry.
Wow.
I'm the worst. We had Under the Desk News on the podcast, and they had like followed me right after that, and I left them on like follow back for like almost like 6 months. And I was like, oh god damn it! And I was like, and that was like Under the Desk News, like they are a big deal, and I was like, oh, I'm such an asshole. God damn it! So I will follow you back, I promise.
I'll be waiting. You know what I mean? Just kidding.
Just waiting. We're all waiting.
So in wrapping it up, where can people find you? What do you want to have people go search out?
Oh, sure. So I'm CatieOsaurus across all social media. I do TikTok, but I'm actually this is not like a secret, but I'm actually working on moving away from TikTok, and I'm going to start doing more long form content on like YouTube. So if you want to go follow me on YouTube, I also have a Twitter. It is, forewarning, it is mostly just like feelings about D&D and shit posting. I have an Instagram if you want to see pictures of my food. And what else do I have?
OnlyFans.
Oh God. I do have an OnlyFans. But you can get to my OnlyFans by going to mostlypans.com, because fuck you, TikTok. I will find a way to advertise. So you can check out my OnlyFans at mostlypans.com.
And her ass.
You can also just and my ass. And you can find out just, all the stuff that I do at CatieOsaurus.com. I also have a podcast. It's called Katie and Eric's Infinite Quest, an ADHD adventure. We talk a lot about life with ADHD and depression. We talk a lot about sex and kink and relationships. We also play D&D. It's a weird podcast, but here we are. And that is, I think, all of the stuff. I think I got all of them in there. So thanks for having me.
You did. Thank you for being here, like, so much. This was such a fun episode. Also, I'm gonna go cry. Just kidding.
Oh, no.
This amazing. Thank you. We look forward to having you back. And the first question I will ask you will be, what the fuck is the crossover between the kink community and D&D? That's gonna be my first question when you come back.
It's a circle. I'll just answer it right now. It's a circle. It's a stack of pancakes.
I love pancakes.
I will ask that again next time this happens. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you all for having me.
All right, y'all. Let's wrap it up.
Y'all have a great time.
You know where to find us.
Okay.
Yeah.
Katie has wine night. Sorry, Kate has wine night to get to.
I got wine night.
I simply have wine to get to, so.
This is a brandy night for me.
All right, y'all. See you next time.
Bye.
Thanks for being here. Bye.